No, go right ahead.
And there's one warning. Sometimes it starts going live before it tells us it's gone live.
Okay.
So I I say to people now, make sure you're not swearing right now,
I'll try not to.
which they laugh at because none of them do. So anywhere from now, it could be live. Damn. And you don't mind if I call you Ken instead of Dr. Ken, is that?
Call me Ken, please.
Okay, so we could be live any second. Um, it says we're live.
Very good.
Ah, there we go. We are live. So while we're just waiting for a few people to join us, there's a couple there already. Um, I thought, yeah, while we're just waiting, and before I do an official interview, official welcome, Ken, I'll just give you a little bit of a background to the podcast and what we're
Yeah,
doing here,
please.
and I'll get my lighting a little bit fixed up. I'm just learning about shadows and lighting. Um, so the SDAQ&A podcast, and those that are just joining, I'm just before we officially start, I'm just and before we officially welcome Ken, I'm just letting him know a little bit about SDAQ&A, and it's a podcast that was started about probably a year ago. There's about 22 episodes, and we basically discuss all things Adventist, from hot potatoes to good things to theology and current events. And recently, a young minister from the Philippines, actually a young student, he's training to be a minister from the Philippines. His name's Lance. He'll be watching today.
Yeah.
He wrote to me and said, I really enjoyed the interviews you did with Des Ford. I was able to interview Des not too long before he passed away.
Yeah.
And so we did three interviews. And he said, is there any way you could interview Pastor William Johnson? And I kind of laughed because I thought there's no way I can contact him. And I said, well, if you can organise it, let's do it. So he went away, and I thought I'd never hear from him again. And a few months later, I got a message back saying, yep, I've coordinated Dr. Johnson
Wow.
to do an interview.
Wow.
And so
Impressive.
only a week or two ago, Dr. Johnson came on and was very gracious to chat with us for over 2 hours. And you're welcome, Ken, to join the group if you want. And so what I began was going live from our group on Facebook
Mhm.
to the members in the group. And we've gone from 200 members to 600 members in just that 2 weeks.
Wow.
There's a bit of interest there because people can only watch this currently live if they are members of the group.
Yeah.
Um, and so we plan to share these interviews as a resource as well as the other podcast interviews and the podcast itself. Um, and then after we've finished the Glacier View series, we'll continue on with the podcast and interviewing lots of other interesting people. So we'd love to get
Yeah.
you back again down the track.
Very good.
So I think we've got a good number. We've got about 20 or 30 people watching. So I think we're ready to begin. I'll just do a little pause so when I record later, I know where the gap is. Hello and welcome to SDA podcast. And now we go live also in our Facebook group, SDA&A, which your listeners are welcome to look up. And those that are here right now watching, I feel a little bit that I've got a dual personality, that I'm talking to a live audience and to the podcast listeners as well, who are just going to be hearing the audio. Today I'm joined by Dr. Ken Samples. Welcome, Dr. Ken, and I'm told I can call you Ken, so welcome,
Yeah.
Ken. Good to have
Well,
you.
it's a pleasure to be with you, Peter. I have had a long interest in everything Seventh-day Adventism, and so it's a pleasure and an honor to be on your program. And so, thank you for thinking about me.
Oh, I was so excited. I think Lance was the one that contacted you as
Yeah,
well, and
right.
he's only 21, and he's just so
Wow.
on fire to present all sides of this story,
Yeah.
and I think he's managed to possibly talk Dr. George Knight into doing an interview as well.
Very good. Yeah. Good.
So I appreciate his efforts there. And when he said you were going to be chatting, I was just thrilled because I think it's important to have people who aren't Adventists but have a love of the gospel to come on the program and share their perspectives. It gives another whole unique perspective. And one of the really interesting things about your connection with this topic is that you were kind of mentored in many ways, or a protege of Dr. Walter Martin. And
Yes. Very, very much so. My apologetics career really began with Walter Martin, and in fact, he was probably the first serious Bible teacher that I had as I was, a college student, and his imprimatur, so to speak, has cast a big shadow on my life. And because he was interested in Adventism, I became interested in Adventism, and I miss Walter a lot. He was a very significant person in my life, um, and I'm glad that people are talking about these issues, because I think it shows, in some measure, the importance of his work as well.
oh yes, totally. I think the influence he and Barnhouse to some degree, because
Yeah,
Barnhouse was kind of the publisher,
right.
the influence they had on talking to the church leaders in the late 50s and releasing questions on doctrine is a pivotal
Yeah,
turning point, I believe, in Adventist history. And so he certainly has had an incredible influence. Um, I'm I'm keen. Like, you met him and started kind of working with him in the late '80s.
yeah,
I've watched the John Ankerberg shows, which were I think '82 or something, and
yeah,
'84 with
yeah,
there's one with Walter Ray and Des Ford, and one with Walter Martin and Dr. Johnson,
right.
and they were just mind blowing to me. I only really started getting to see them when YouTube was kind of invented, whenever that
Yeah,
was.
right.
And I've watched them many, many times. I watched them both again in the last 24 hours. And every time I watch, there's some sort of wisdom that comes out.
Mm.
And Walter Martin's got a very honest, upfront, um, almost provocative. I mean that in a good way. What you see is what you get.
Yeah.
Were you, even though you kind of met him in the late '80s, were you aware of him before that, and were you aware of these shows on Ankerberg?
Yes, I grew up kind of in a nominal Catholic family, and right at I began college, I read C.S. Lewis, I bumped into Walter Martin, and I moved toward an evangelical Protestant view. I attended Walter's Bible class. He had a long-standing class that he taught in Southern California. I attended that class for a number of years before I went to work for Walter. In fact, the first time I met Des Ford, Des was filling in for Walter Martin and preaching on justification by faith. And I thought, who is this Martin Luther I'm listening to here?
Oh,
So I knew of some of the backdrop. I'd seen some of the programs. In fact, I'd even written a term paper on Adventism when I was in college, kind of looking at these issues. So when I came to work for Walter in early 1987, I was kind of designated as the specialist on Seventh-day Adventism.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm very keen to get your opinions of these later years with Walter and his reflections on Adventism. But
Right.
first, let's go right back and look at Questions on Doctrine and the Barnhouse Martin duo and
Right.
their work with cults. And my understanding is they were about to release a book that included Adventists and Adventism as a cult. Can you now kind of unpack a bit of that big story to give us some background to that from the Walter Martin perspective and what then occurred leading up to the release of Questions on Doctrine?
Yeah, happy to do so. So in the late 1950s, what I would call kind of counter-cult apologetics was just at the beginning. There were few evangelicals writing in the field. Anthony Hoekema was more reformed in orientation. John Gerstner was a Calvinist theologian who wrote in the field. And Walter was quite a young man. He had been mentored by Donald Gray Barnhouse. In fact, Walter was about the age in the late 50s that I was when I began working with Walter. And there was planned to have a book that would cover Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science, and Seventh-day Adventism. And one of the Adventist administrators had contacted Donald Gray Barnhouse and actually complimented some of the preaching that Barnhouse had done on salvation by grace through faith in Christ. And Barnhouse was kind of taken aback. Why would you be impressed with justification by faith? You're an Adventist, and don't Adventists believe in kind of works righteousness? Well, Barnhouse kind of said to his young protege, Walter Martin, I think you need to look into this. So Walter began an extensive evaluation of Adventism. And I think it was Unruh who said, yeah, let's cooperate with Barnhouse and Martin. So Walter met with three individuals. We call them Frieda, Froom, Reed, and Anderson. And I have to say, Peter, that Walter was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He was a straight shooter. And I think he went into this thinking Adventism was sub-Christian, that it was not consistent with historic Christianity, that maybe it had an Arian view of Christ. Its view of salvation seemed rather legalistic. There was concern about Ellen White as a living prophet. But Walter was very impressed with Froom, Reed, and Anderson. I think especially Anderson. He thought he saw something in these men and in what they believed that was fundamentally different than what he had encountered in the Watchtower and in the Latter-day Saints. And when he brought that back to Barnhouse, of course, it was kind of controversial, but Barnhouse knew Walter was a good researcher. He was forthright. He was careful. And of course, when they came out with their findings that Adventism was a Christian denomination, it was heterodox rather than heretical. 25% of the subscribers to Eternity magazine, edited by Donald Gray Barnhouse, they withdrew their subscription. I mean, I can't imagine an evangelical magazine today taking a risk like that.
No, that was very brave.
I think that Barnhouse and Martin were courageous. They had a lot of confidence in the Adventist people that they knew. I would say, looking back, I'm not sure Walter and Barnhouse knew that there was an undercurrent of disagreement in Adventism at that time. I don't think Walter knew that there was a traditionalist as well as an evangelical branch.
Mm.
And I think some of that tension came out later, but Walter always spoke very respectfully about the Adventists that he encountered. And quite frankly, I think he thought that was one of the accomplishments in his ministry that he was most proud of. And I'll tell you why, because people like he and I who deal with doctrine and deal with heresy, and when we think, wow, this is actually a Christian group, it is. I think he saw it as something that was very significant, and I think it even led later to feeling rather disappointed that it had not worked out quite the way he thought it or had hoped it would.
He even later, I think, maybe felt that he was hoodwinked a little bit, even though I'm not suggesting that. My belief is that they were very genuine in wanting to present a progression with Adventism. It's interesting. You're mentioning Anderson there. His brother lived in Kurrambong here, where I live. His name was O.K. Anderson, and he was very opposed to his brother being on that.
Oh wow!
Committee, yeah. Just as I'll
tell you a brief story. When this is probably 1988, Walter and I went to Loma Linda University and gave a talk. And after the meeting, Walter and I met with Anderson's wife. Anderson had passed away at that point. And boy, Walter and Mrs. Anderson, I could tell there was such a real connection there. I was just really impressed by the graciousness and the respect that he had. So he saw something that he respected, and he saw something that he thought was not cultic, it was Christian.
Yeah. And I think he accurately assessed that too. I think there's really within Adventism almost two constantly opposing, it's not left and right as far as traditional, conservative, liberal in that, in my opinion. It's more a deep-seated, this is our understanding of Adventism. No, this is our understanding of Adventism. And the two you can't put in a box, but the two, generally speaking, have run into conflict with each other at several key points in Adventist history.
Yeah.
The actual book, Questions on Doctrine, was that, I know it was sanctioned by the General Conference of Adventists at the time. Did they release it, or was it a Barnhouse release? Or was it a co-release?
I think it was published by the Seventh-day Adventists. I think, however, Eternity Magazine promoted it, made it clear that this was the document that had come out of these types of dialogues. And, Walter was very much affirming of that book. Later on, when the book went out of print, Walter was disappointed by that and wondered why that book had not remained.
Yeah.
But at the time, no, I believe it was indeed published by the Adventists, but Barnhouse and Martin made evangelicals aware of it.
What's incredible to note, that not only did he influence kind of a turning point in Adventism there, but that book, and because it was sanctioned by the GC and a more progressive leadership from top to bottom, as in the GC level, the membership rose within Adventism, so that by the time, so there was about 1 million members around then, but by the time we come to the Ankerberg show with Martin and Johnson, there's 4 million Adventists.
Wow!
And that is largely because of that book, because people saw this as, oh, okay, so they're not a cult and it's an evangelical church, and they joined, and that created a garden for people like Des Ford, again, my opinion, to flourish and to grow. And so a lot of people that became Adventists under that kind of that new paradigm fell in love with the church and see as much ownership with the church as the people who want to go back to a more historicist kind of view. So it's an incredibly influential book, but I think in many ways not talked about so much because it was taken off the shelves by the time the
Yeah.
more conservative leadership had taken on the steering of the Adventist ship. And so it was removed. So I understand why Walter would have been concerned and upset. And then as he would have been observing through the 70s the rise of Des Ford and the often called New Theology, he probably would have felt comfortable and, oh, that's a good sign. But by the time we had Glacier View and the defrocking of Des, he must have started being very concerned. Can you tell us a little bit about that observation?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Walter developed a very strong friendship with Desmond Ford, and he was perplexed by Des being sacked. I have to tell you, when I first heard Des preach, I thought, my goodness, I'm not sure I've ever heard another Protestant present justification with such clarity and with such passion. And Walter and I both viewed Des as kind of, one of the fathers of the evangelical Adventist movement, and to have such an articulate voice, such a passionate voice, publicly dismissed. That was the beginning of Walter wondering what's going on in Seventh-day Adventism, and did I get the straight scoop? If so, why is this happening? And Des and Walter continued a friendship long after that. I know a couple different times Des came and spoke at Walter's Bible class, and we did events together. That was Walter, Des, and I. So yeah, there was a growing concern, and in many ways, both Walter and I went to Des and asked, Des, tell us what's happening here. What, from your vantage point, what's going on here? Is there a change, or was there division right from the beginning? How strong is the traditionalist perspective? How significant is the evangelical side? So, Des was a part in kind of helping us to understand what was happening during these events. And it's hard not to, to be perfectly candid, Des was always very encouraging to me. And I was just very impressed with his scholarship. He was a tough guy, but he was also a gentleman. And Walter and I were very strong friends with Des, his wife, and supported his ministry.
Is there, it's really good to hear that perspective, actually, the respect that he garnered from outside of the Adventist church. We often just hear the controversy, and it's very, and a lot of people respected him within the Adventist church, but we often forget that he was well respected in the broader evangelical community as well. So it's very good to hear that.
And, Peter, I might add, too, that Des never stopped being an Adventist, in a sense. I mean, I've had many hours with him going back and forth on issues like the Sabbath, talking about conditional immortality, annihilationism. I mean, as sharp as the differences were in him being dismissed at Glacier View, we still had differences, as Christian to Christian, looking at some of these distinctive features of Seventh-day Adventism.
Yes. Yeah, that often confused me, actually, that there was still a deep Adventist kind of thread running through his post-leaving or being defrocked. And that would have definitely led to some interesting discussions.
Yeah.
Did you happen to record any of those discussions?
I wish I would have. I know there, there are some, I don't know if you're aware of some of the last recordings of Walter, Des, and myself. This would have been very close to Walter's death around June of 1989. Some of those are still available. Uh, and I'll try to, I'll see if I can get you in touch with some of that
That
material.
would be great, because the great thing about social media and what we're doing here with the live feed is that people are commenting, and we can add material as a link below to this to
Yeah,
relate to
yeah.
this conversation. I've just got a mental blank about, did Ankerberg do an interview with Walter Martin and Des, or was it only Walter Ray and Des?
Well, Walter appeared on the Ankerberg program about Adventism a couple different times. I think he did one with Ray, but he also did one with Johnson, which was
Yeah,
quite uh, controversial, kind of
yeah.
confrontational, if you will. Ankerberg, by the way, was initially kind of on the side that Adventism was a cult, and maybe Walter had made a mistake. I think through it all, Ankerberg came to have greater respect for Walter's position. But yeah, those tapes were those recordings, I think, had a lot of importance, and again, it extended the idea that Walter was trying to figure out what has happened in Adventism from the late 50s now into the early 80s and to the late 80s.
Hmm.
And he was trying to track what happened to questions on doctrine. Are there now two distinct branches in Seventh-day Adventism? And of course, the flop about Ford remained quite controversial.
So after that period, then, did he um, do much writing about these doubts and thoughts that he had, or were they more just accruing a bunch of information and chatting to you about it and others? Did he start putting pen to paper with a lot of this?
Well, when I started working with Walter, I was employed in January of 1987, and very soon after I began working with him, I was asked to write um, kind of a reappraisal of Seventh Day Adventism. I think we called it an update on Seventh Day
Oh,
Adventism.
interesting.
And that article is still available on the web. It's
Wow.
entitled From Controversy to Crisis, an updated assessment of Seventh day Adventism. In that article, I kind of track what was happening in the 50s, then bringing in questions on doctrine, Glacier view, and kind of I then began talking more about a traditional view of Adventism and an evangelical view of Adventism. That article then led an invitation to Walter and myself to come to Loma Linda, the seminary there in California. And that was a presentation, and I think tapes are available from that as well.
Boy, that would be a valuable document to contribute to
But
the series.
but by the way, do you know Pastor Larry Christoffel? Does that name ring a bell?
Not to me, but I'm sure there's many listeners that would know that.
He would be a person who would have access to a lot of these tapes. And in fact, Pastor Christoffel, an Adventist that was a pastor for a long time in Loma Linda, he and I interviewed dozens and dozens of Adventist pastors
Oh, wow.
about where they stood. You really should get
I
Larry
would
on the
love,
program. He could
yeah.
give you a lot of good documentation, and he would be a very important, I think, voice to consider.
I'm just wondering if someone that's watching, if they could just make a little note in the comments. What was the name again?
Larry Christoffel, he is a pastor still in Southern California, but I don't think he's any longer in Loma Linda.
Did he and yourself and Walter interview Adventist ministers that were disgruntled, or just a general? You just had general interviews across the board.
Well, we came up with a survey. I think this was actually after Walter had passed away, about 1990. Christoffel and myself came up with a survey asking questions about how do you understand the investigative judgment? How do you understand the role of Ellen G. White? What is your view of justification by faith? And we interviewed pastors and theologians that were more traditional, some more evangelical, and I might add some in the Loma Linda area had gone to more liberal schools like Claremont, and they held more higher critical views of the Bible. They held more of a theologically liberal perspective. This, by the way, then later led to a conference, I think about 2007, where I was invited to the seminary, and there was a conference about questions on doctrine.
Wow.
Must have been maybe like a 30-year, and I wrote a paper for that, which is available on the web as well.
Oh boy, I would love links to these. We'll have to add you to the group if you're okay with
Yeah,
that. And
I'll send you some of these links.
yeah,
Yeah, happy
I
to.
would love that. So it does sound like, because what I think happened, I know as a young boy, I was too young to really know what was going on during the 80s. Even though I should have known better, I would have been in my 20s by then. But the church was quite good at kind of suppressing a lot of this kind of information. We just didn't really hear about it, and it wasn't until the 90s that I started discovering a lot of this stuff. I think I mentioned off air the 1919 conference minutes that had gone missing had become available in the 70s. I remember reading those, reading about 1888, reading a lot of Des Ford, reading Bob Brinsmead's book. I think it was, is it 1844 Revisited? I think it's
Yeah, and then later the Shaking of Adventism. Yeah,
Shaking of Adventism. Lowell Tarling has written some amazing books as well. I think The Edges of Adventism. I read Walter Ray's White Lie book, and I just kind of had this all of a sudden in the 90s, just this barrage of incredible, of revelations, I guess. But a lot of Adventists, there was some pockets of liberal Adventism that you could kind of live within those waters and not really be scathed too much by the more critical elements. However, it's sad in a way to think that maybe Walter Martin was right. Not saying that Adventism is a cult, but these more historicist views on righteousness by faith and how to get into heaven and this kind of thing are starting to bear out in current events, with the division coming up with the compliance document that now is, I don't know if you'd call it in policy, but it's definitely able to be enacted on. 6 unions have been warned. Do you know much about these current events within Adventism that Walter Martin would be even more upset with? Because you chatted with him, with you, Des, and Walter only just a few years ago. So did the current events come up in those topics, or in your discussions, or was it just more reflective?
No, I think both. There certainly. I spent a lot of time talking with Walter Martin about the early meetings, and then the interactions on Ankerberg, and then later Walter and I meeting with the entire theological faculty at Loma Linda University. There were these issues that were coming up, and so I think there was a growing sense, and here is my take. I think that Froom, Reed, and Anderson wanted to put the best face on Adventism possible, and I understand that. I'm not sure that Walter understood that there were some very strong currents in different directions at that early point, and I think that led to Walter maybe thinking, hey, wait a second, have I not been given the straight scoop? Or where did all of this tension come from? I think in my own assessment, I mean, in the article I wrote in 1988, an updated assessment of Seventh-day Adventism, I compared what I called evangelical Adventism with traditional Adventism. I alluded to kind of a liberal element. Later, I wrote an article in Christianity Today in the 1990s where I talked about 4 varieties of Adventism: evangelical, traditional, liberal, and more cultural Adventists.
Mm.
And so, talking with Des Ford and talking with some people, and by the way, I should also mention this. There are some people in the countercult community. Now, this is this is a particular type of apologetics, the defense of the faith. This deals with the orthodoxy or less than orthodoxy of religious groups. There are people that I know that were working in the field when I was, who wonder if Adventism has not taken the wrong step, and maybe Walter and Ken Samples were duped by this. I don't know that they have made the kind of investment necessary to be able to draw those conclusions, but I should tell you there are some people who've left Adventism, have felt that they were to some degree deceived. And so there are people in the countercult community that are wondering about Seventh-day Adventism and are wondering about this reevaluation that went on with Barnhouse, Walter, and then later with myself.
Yeah, that's interesting, and there is grounds for concern. Did Walter have an opportunity to almost have another kind of a go at interviewing leaders, or did they kind of not accept? Did he try and get some interviews with some of the leaders through the 80s and 90s, 2000?
Yeah, we, one of the last conversations I had with Walter, 2 weeks before Walter passed away, he died in June of 1989, 2 weeks before his death. Walter, Martin, Des Ford, and I were in Riverside, California, not far from Loma Linda, giving various talks on Adventism. And Walter and I at the time were kind of planning out a book that would reevaluate Adventism. And Walter definitely wanted to have more interviews. My impression was that a lot of the administrators did not want to talk to Walter Martin. And he didn't feel like he didn't feel like they were as accessible in the late 80s as they had been in the 50s.
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment. In fact, I credit William Johnson as being quite courageous for doing that interview.
Yeah.
Adventists aren't that good or aren't as experienced in talking with the secular world or the larger evangelical Christian world. There's a little bit of caution and a little bit of naivety there, but I really think he was very courageous to do that. But
Yeah.
I think it was possibly the last time an Adventist leader was put into the spotlight and asked difficult questions publicly. I can't think of any time since 1984 in that interview. And I would have I reckon that Walter possibly tried to talk to some of these guys. Are you aware of that?
Well, I do know that from 88 to 89, we were in contact with some of the faculty members on the theological staff of Loma Linda University and other places, and there was some discussion of trying to get administrators involved in the dialogue. Later, when we did our survey, this is with the pastor that I mentioned, we wanted to have more Adventist leadership to respond to some of this, but most of the interviews we did were theological faculty. And then I would say I think it's the Southeastern Conference here in Loma Linda, Riverside area. I'll bet we interviewed more than 100 pastors, theologians, church workers. And my recollection was that if the data is to be believed, and of course I tried to give it the benefit of the doubt, I thought that an evangelical side was probably in the ascendancy there, although there were some very strong traditional views expressed as well.
Yeah, so you felt there was kind of a positive rise and move upward and forward. And I think a lot of Adventists felt that. I know as a young Adventist, we were told, hang in there, it's getting better, things are changing,
Yeah.
because there was a massive, I'm talking about the positive effect of questions on doctrine. There was a massive backlash to it as well.
Yeah.
Massive.
Yeah.
Like a movement called the Concerned Brethren grew out of their distaste for that book. And
Yeah.
in many ways, that movement has influenced every conservative movement. The Standish Brothers were
Sure.
most very powerful in
Yeah.
presenting their opposition to Des Ford and the New Theology and questions on doctrine. And their influence can be traced, I believe, through to all the current independent ministries, the fundamental ministries within Adventism, and even to leadership at high levels. So that had a profound effect on Adventism. And so growing up, we would be constantly, if you're a bit more liberal, you'd be constantly having conflicting tension and arguments with the more conservative element. But we were told that things were changing, things are getting better, and right up through to Jan Paulsen becoming president, there was hope that the progressives would at least be able to, or the leaders would at least create an environment where both sides could coexist, learn
Yeah.
to agree to disagree. But after he left, and I think Ted Wilson came on straight after him, really that ascension of progress and optimism started to wane. And then when they had the last GC where there was the no vote on women's ordination, when they then brought in the compliance document, and then in the recent Autumn Council, I think September last year, where 6 unions were warned and told that sanctions would be forthcoming, I think we can assess now that this ascension is now declining.
Okay.
I'm surprised that a lot of liberal Adventists are still very hopeful. There's an inbuilt positivity and optimism, I think, that a lot of Adventists have.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why. But I fear that if things continue the way they are, it would appear that Walter Martin would truly have been right to have his concerns, and I wish that he had been able to maybe explore some of that more publicly as well. That might have been able to help. Yeah, and
I, I I have a question. I have been told, and I wonder what your perspective is on this, that the largest body of Adventist people are outside the United States. I have also been told that outside of America, the traditional wing of the church is strongest.
yes,
Would you agree with that?
yes. I mean, a lot of these votes of the no vote, the compliance document, the Autumn Council, they're still not 80-20 to conservative. There's still a bit of a closer kind of race, but yes, the general trend is that the conservative elements are more represented outside of America,
Okay.
and are gaining power and influence politically, and and again, I have to really highlight these are just my opinions as an
Sure.
observer,
Yeah.
someone that's
Yeah.
been quite a keen observer over the years. Um, and I never would criticize my Adventist brothers and sisters in the sense of their character and personalities. I was chatting to a businessman recently in town. He's just near where I live, and he's not an Adventist. I don't think he's a Christian even. But he said, "I've never met an Adventist I didn't like,"
Ah,
and that's true. So these aren't issues that I'm trying to drag down Adventism or to raise up to drag down Adventism, but they're issues that I think are affecting people adversely, and I think something needs to happen or come to a head to, as I said earlier, there's this tension since Walter Martin was interviewing Frida,
yeah,
and it's ongoing to this day. And I just
yeah,
feel like there needs to be some kind of conversation about it to bring it out more.
yeah.
And you just alluded to the conversation you had with Walter before he died. There's been rumours going around that he was going to release a book saying that he, had changed his mind and Adventism was now heading towards being more of a cult. And you're saying that he was going to release a book, but do you think he was going to say that in his book?
Well, he never communicated to me that he would move in the direction of reversing himself. But I think there was, he had talked to me about the two of us collaborating on a book, and that would be to kind of tell the story, but it would also then raise all of these provocative questions to the new generation of Adventist leaders. And we would, raise Glacier View. We would raise a variety of issues. So I think it was a book that, I never got the impression that Walter was going to reverse his view, but he had a lot of questions, and he wanted to press for answers because, again, he took Barnhouse and Martin took a lot of heat for that decision.
Yes. Yeah. He had skin in
You
the game.
know, they were putting their reputations on the line, and again, I mean, I have met so many Adventists. I know lots of Seventh-day Adventists, and I have to say the vast majority have been people of goodwill. Most of them, of course, that I know are more of the evangelical variety, but um, I there's a lot of positive things in Adventism, and I think Walter saw that, but he had some questions, and it would have been interesting to have a whole new generation of administrators and theologians to revisit those kinds of questions. And I think that's the kind of book we hoped might be something we could put together.
It's interesting that you're kind of alluding to the fact that he was almost frustrated that he wasn't really getting the answers. And in the '84 interview on the Ankerberg show, he's frustrated that he's not
Yeah,
getting the
yeah.
answers. The Adventist leadership seems very good at just being able to kind of make you see a little bit of something, and then oh yeah, oh hang on, no, and to pin to be pinned down. There's a couple
Well,
of
they are politicians after all, and
yeah,
that's
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, it was interesting. I think getting to know both Walter and Des. Neither one of them were politicians. They had deep convictions. They stood up for their convictions. Um, and I, but I would still say that Des still defended. He had a very high view of Ellen White, even
yeah.
after the plagiarism, even after a lot of the controversy. And of course, I think probably I talked with him just I bet about a year before he passed away, and we were on a program talking about, of all things, David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. It was the 25th anniversary, and we were dialoguing, and I could still tell that Des was still an Adventist
Yeah.
in many ways.
Yeah. Someone I'm just looking over here. I've managed to set up a monitor now, so I can kind of see people's
Right.
comments, but I'm also aware that I'm getting older and need some different kind of glasses. Occasionally, I peer over, and
Yeah.
I'm going to be interviewing on Monday Pastor Lloyd Grolleman, who, because I'm trying to get people that are centre, left, and right, and he
Sure.
perhaps he's probably more supportive of Des the the outcome of Glacier View than you or I may be.
Yeah.
Um, and he's just said something that I just want to raise and get your thoughts on, if that's okay.
Sure.
He says, I think you guys on this thread need to accept that there was a vote. You may not like the result. He says, I don't, but you might. Sorry, I just need to hold it a bit closer. But you might want to recognise that in Australia and the Western world, women are employed in ministry on exactly the same basis as their male counterparts. There's nothing I can't do in ministry that the female pastor next door to me can't do. We get the same wage, the same titles, do the same jobs. It's all exactly the same. We can and should continue to advance change. And I think it's great that he's wanting to advance change, and I'm looking forward to chatting with him. But the first sentence, I think you guys need to accept that there was a vote. One of the interesting things, and what made me think of it, was you're saying that Des respected Ellen White. In the early, I might be wrong, late 1800s, early 1900s, she helped set up the unions within Adventism. So they've got the world divisions, the unions, and then the conferences, and then the local churches.
Yeah.
And the unions were set up to kind of oversee subtle subcultural differences within their region. And I think that's a brilliant idea. I can see why Des respected lots of her thoughts and ideas and stuff. And so my answer to Lloyd would be, yes, it was taken to a vote, but that was a global vote. What we were hoping was that the unions would retain the right to decide for their area whether women could be ordained or not, depending on the subcultural conditions of their region. So what concerns me is Ellen White spoke strongly about this kingship kind of thing. She did not like the idea of the General Conference, the president, having this kind of global authority. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on that. Would you agree that it's like some people say, well, if you go to church, you've got to have your rules and abide by them. But I thought it was a good way of setting up the unions was a good way of keeping things a little bit more open around the world, depending on, as I said, the regions. In your experience with general evangelical body, is there a sense that people make up their own mind in certain areas? Are you opposed to kind of a centralized global kingship kind of rule over Christianity? Just what are your thoughts on that bunch of
Yeah.
things I just said?
Yeah. Let me start with a bit of a comment about Ellen White. My understanding is that her husband James White held kind of an Arian Christology. So Arianism, of course, would be the idea that Jesus isn't fully divine. The Father created the Son. So it is a denial of the full deity of Christ and a denial of the Trinity. What some Adventist theologians have told me is that Ellen White had some kind of a Methodist connection, and
Yeah.
that Ellen White played a role in the Adventist church moving away from Arianism toward Trinitarianism.
Yes.
I would say that I think Ellen White had some good theological instincts. Now, the idea of a living prophet, the idea of an inspired writer, and the plagiarisms and things like that trouble me. But when I think about the history of Adventism, I wonder where the Adventist church would have been early on had she not moved the church, if in fact that's the case, that she moved it in the Trinitarian direction. Your broader question, of course, evangelicals have quite a controversy when it comes to the ordination of women.
They're divided as well.
Yeah, complementarianism versus egalitarianism. And then I would even add that, the questions of the questions of difference here. I mean, um, evangelicals have some very strong differing ideas, but there is this very common, I think, evangelical consensus. And I, one of the things that interests me about Seventh Day Adventism, I think I think creeds have played a very significant role in the history of Christianity in terms of kind of laying the groundwork for a basic orthodoxy. And what I find interesting in Adventism is it's rather non-creedal, but there is this stage where it could have gone one way or another. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, have remained with an Arian Christology. They're Unitarian. I would say the Mormons have a tritheism, three individual gods. Somewhere along the line, I think that the Adventists made the right move. And I'm speaking, of course, because I agree with Christian orthodoxy and against those kinds of views. But could I say, Peter, I think the evangelical church today, and that word is harder and harder to define, I think we have some of the same problems that Adventists have. I mean, I think I think there's a very liberal, and I don't mean that politically, I mean it theologically. There's more of an evangelical liberal bent. There's more the Reformation Protestant bent. And then there are many evangelicals that I think are quite cultural. So we also have problems, and they are to some degree similar to the Adventist challenges. Lest I appear like I'm coming along and saying we've solved all these issues and we're critiquing your church.
No, you're not at all. And I only kind of raised those kind of observations because Adventists often don't really know a lot about what the evangelical movement is up to, thinking about.
Yeah.
And I respect what Pastor Lloyd was saying there, where continue to move forward in advance with the idea and hope that things change for the good. Where he and I may disagree is that I'm suggesting that there is a demonstrable evidence to suggest that the trajectory is going the other way. And that's why people are very more frustrated now than I think they have ever been.
Okay. Wow.
And I think my prediction is Ted Wilson will get in again at the next GC this year. And 90% of people disagree with me. But I did predict the no vote, and I did predict the compliance document would be passed, and I did predict warnings and sanctions would come, and they all have. So maybe this prediction will come true. But what I'm saying is that if that does happen, I'm very interested to see the reaction from my Adventist brothers and sisters, if they will be as positive in that climate post 2020. Do you have thoughts and understandings of the compliance document and the ramifications upon Adventism at all? Do you know much about that?
I can't say I know a lot about it. Could you kind of summarize it for me?
There's 5 or 6, and look, I'm not a real expert on it at all, but there's 5 or 6 areas that they desire Adventist workers and leaders to comply to.
Okay.
Or they will be warned, sanctioned, reprimanded, sanctioned, and I guess eventually asked to leave. Okay. And one of them is that they must agree that women's ordination should not happen. There's some quite strong views on contemporary music. There's some strong views on the 6 to 10,000 year Earth. The strong statements that must be complied to, and against gay marriage and that whole kind of sphere of its topic. And so what's worrying people is that, well, who gets to decide what future things may be added to this.
I see.
What about people that want to act on their conscience in the area that they live and say, well, we feel that women can be ordained?
Yeah,
And fine, if you're in a different country where it's not ready or you're not wanting to happen.
yeah,
So the ramifications of this being passed, which it has been passed, and if you were interested in learning a bit more about it, the Autumn Council, if you YouTubed Autumn Council Seventh-day Adventism Tuesday night meeting or Tuesday afternoon meeting,
okay,
there's a moment there where Jan Paulson gets up to the mic and they're giving people opportunity to comment on the warnings that are about to be given. There were to be 4 warnings and 2 reprimands to unions around the world. And he gets up and pleads that the council, please, take these warnings off the table, please. He was almost in tears. And Ted Wilson, after he's finished, wraps him up and says, well, it's been voted through. We're now just acting on whether it's going to be a warning or a reprimand, and
wow,
over to Mike 5. And I just,
yeah,
that moment saddened me more than anything
yeah,
that I watched that day. This leader that had risen to be the president of the Adventist Church had a heart for unity with diversity,
yeah,
to be kind of shut down. So I think it's a really important document to understand. And a lot of people say, oh, it won't affect grassroots. But just imagine a union leader
yeah,
is told he must comply. It goes against his conscience, but he forces downwards to his conference levels that you must comply. They force down to their pastors, you must comply. That goes to the grassroots. It's something if you're interested in, I think I'd be
yeah,
very interested in people that are smarter than me to look at these things and give commentary on them.
yeah.
And maybe down the track we can have another chat about that, because I'd love your opinion on it.
I wanted to tell you what I think it's an interesting story. For the last 23 years, I've worked at another apologetic organization called Reasons to Believe. One of our distinctive areas is, of course, the issue of science and faith, the issue of creation, which Adventists are very interested in. Of course, our point of view is an old earth creationist view. A number of years ago, I did an interview with Ron Numbers,
Yes. You wrote The
who
Health Prophetess.
yes,
Yeah.
Ron Numbers had written a lot about the so-called clash between Christianity and science, and Numbers had argued that actually that was an overstatement, that Christianity and science had much more of a respectful relationship. But I then said to Dr. Numbers, I said, I'm an old Seventh-day Adventist researcher. And of
Wow.
course, he and I began talking, and Numbers, of course, had involvement in the initial investigation into the plagiarisms of
Yes.
Ellen White. And he not only left Adventism, but became a skeptic. And
Oh, wow.
it
I didn't
was
know.
it was kind of interesting. He was kind of reluctant to go back and talk about his Adventist roots, but I said, Ron, I remember your name in the Adventist context, but that's kind of a young Earth, old Earth
Yeah.
issue that had popped out of. And I might say that there are some people who would associate the belief in a young Earth, 6 to 10,000 year old, which is a very controversial thing in evangelicalism as well.
Yeah.
But many people have tied it to that young Earth creationism has deep Seventh-day Adventist roots.
Interesting. Well, 2 things, if I can comment on that. The book that Numbers wrote, The Health Prophetess,
Yeah.
was the first book that started to open my mind to things.
Wow.
I had to stop reading it. I'd read a couple of chapters and I had to leave
Yeah.
it. It took me about 4 years to read because I just felt it was shaking my faith in Adventism.
Yeah.
Um, So I encourage people to find that book. It's a very fascinating, well documented and written book. Um, and I personally don't mind if people believe that the Earth's 6,000 years, or you know,
Yeah, yeah,
billions of years, or the universe is 13, 14 billion years. I don't mind what people choose to believe. What I don't like is that a document can be written that you must comply and believe this, or you're going to lose your job,
indeed.
or be warned.
Yeah,
That's what worries me.
yeah,
I would love to see an Adventist church and a bigger evangelical church body be very accepting of people having divergent views.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but I think we're allowed to ask questions, and the truth should withstand scrutiny. And I just
Absolutely.
can't help asking questions.
Hey, that's the way I'm wired, and
Yeah,
the truth can stand up,
yeah,
and yeah, I will look into some of these things you've mentioned. I
yeah. I'd
have
love
not known
your
about. I'll
thoughts
see if
on
I
that.
can
I
find
really,
out more information.
yeah, I
Yeah.
really would love your thoughts on that, and I'd love people to comment below as well. Um, do you think, would you be interested in writing a Questions on Doctrine revisited book, and see if you could talk some of the high level leaders to to have a chat with you? I'd be interested.
Well, I have had a long-standing relationship with a number of Adventist theologians and some administrators, and I'm still interested. I don't know if I can commit myself to a book, but I remain interested. I
Yeah.
remain interested in what's happening, and to some extent, Peter, because Walter was a very important person to me, and I think what he was involved with Adventism in the 50s, I later became involved in the 80s and 90s. So part of this is important to us because of the work that we did, and
Exactly. You're carrying the torch.
yeah, um, you know, I I believe in what I like to call it the golden rule of apologetics, and what that simply means is you attempt to treat other people's beliefs the way you want yours treated. It doesn't mean you accept everything people believe, but
Yeah.
it means that you try to be fair minded. It means you give the benefit of the doubt. It means that you're respectful. And I think that Walter and I have always tried to do that. We tried to approach Adventism in a fair minded way, and I think it's very critical. And what that means is some of the points you've been making are very relevant. You have to ask the difficult questions.
Mm.
Christians should be critical thinkers. Christians should care about the truth. And I think Christian leaders need to be different than your average political leaders. I think they need to have courage, they need to have candor. And of course, all of us are aspiring by grace to live that kind of life. I don't always live up to the golden rule of apologetics, but it is very important that I strive toward it. And I think Walter demonstrated that in the 50s, that he met this group that maybe he was tempted to write off as a cult. But he said, wait a second, it seems more
Yeah.
complicated. There's something happening here.
Yeah.
And I wanna look into it. And I have to say, I still admire my old teacher Walter for wanting to invest in a group that he thought was
Yes.
genuinely Christian.
Yes. And I think a large number of people value that and value the way he approached it as well. I'll just quickly read a little bit that Lloyd wrote back
Sure.
to what I said there. Um, this is a good church with generally good people. Our leadership is also generally full of men and women who want the best for our church. We are miles ahead of other movements where women can't even get a look in, other denominations, and that's true. And what I'm saying is I'm not saying that Adventists aren't good and Adventist leaders aren't good. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there is an obvious tension and conflict within the Adventist Church, and like Walter Martin and yourself, is you're intrigued as to why there is,
Right.
and you're just asking we're just asking questions in the hope that restoration, reflection, rejuvenation, healing can take place.
Right.
Can you just, because I know that you've probably got a little bit of a time frame, but and I could chat to you for hours. Can you give us a little bit of your thoughts on Glacier View? How much did you know about the politics of it? Did you think Des was just kind of, well, he presented his views. The views were shown to be quite different to distinctive Adventist views, and therefore they asked him to leave? Or do you think there was a bit of manoeuvring going on that he was kind of thrown under the bus a little bit? And were you kind of aware of this at the time?
Yeah. Well, I guess it would be correct to say, kind of viewed Des in rather heroic terms. I thought he was a very courageous individual. I thought he put a lot on the line. Now, part of that too is he and I agreed on a lot of these issues, and I wanted to encourage and promote evangelical Adventism. I thought that was the most healthy form of Adventist thought. There have been people who have come to me, independent of my discussions with Des, and have said that Des was not very workable, not very practical, that they probably could have come to a meaningful working through where Des could have remained an Adventist, but Des was a bull in a china shop. I know Des. Des was very strong, and that was one of the things I most admired about him. I have to say that, when I looked into the issue, it did seem that there were people that went into Glacier View with a theological agenda already in mind. And so I've heard a couple different sides. I have heard that Des wouldn't cooperate, that he probably could have negotiated a more meaningful, and it could have remained on the faculty. On the other hand, I've also heard that there were people who were looking for the opportunity to try to eliminate that very strong evangelical voice that he had. I will frankly admit I love Des Ford. Let me say again, I have a lot of friends and colleagues who I think are some of the most articulate presenters of a Protestant evangelical perspective. When it came to justification by faith, I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody, including Martin, who was any more articulate than Des Ford when it came to salvation by grace, through faith, not by works, in Christ. I remember the first time I heard him preach, I thought, this must be what Luther sounded like. So I have a real affection to Des, and I saw him as a heroic figure. But I also know that, our churches do have political issues and issues to sort out. I just frankly think the Adventists lost such a credible voice. And again, I mean, Des was always trying to push back with me and Walter about the Sabbath, he was always debating us about these other issues.
Yeah.
And so I think the Adventists lost a lot when they lost Des Ford.
Yeah. Yeah. And I quite like that he didn't compromise. I mean, when they had the Glacier View, they had this consensus document. He said, "Okay, well, look, I can live with that. I can work within that," and that didn't get him kicked out. So Neil Wilson came up with convincing some academics to write the 10-point statement or document,
Yeah.
which was harder for him to agree with because they kind of dug a bit deeper into the distinctive differences between Des' views and the church's. I think the 27 fundamentals, the Dallas document, all these documents, and he just couldn't go against that. And I think some people said, "Well, look, just compromise, things will change, go slow."
Right. Right.
I'm the person that kind of, has did that all my life. Yeah, it'll change, go slow, don't worry. But you've got this one life to live and contribute, and I really respect that he said, "No, no, I'm not going to make these adjustments and water
Yeah.
down my message." Imagine if Luther had people asking him to water down the document
Right.
he nailed to the door. I
Right.
respect that. I don't see that as a fault, and I think you agree. I think
Indeed.
that's a really
Indeed.
a wonderful attribute that he had.
Yeah.
I interviewed John Rosier last night, and it was great to see the passion he had for Des as well. And he
Yeah.
held up the 1,000-page thesis, or the document that Des
Yeah.
presented to Glacier View to the
Right.
people before it to read, and he just was holding it up with passion, saying, "This I've never heard righteousness by faith and the gospel described so clearly."
Right.
And you're saying a similar thing, and yeah, I just had this thought last night. What a loss! What a
Yeah.
loss! What a voice snuffed out within the church.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Peter, I would like to give you some links to some of the things I've written, maybe put you in contact with some other people that you may want to invite, or you may want to
Yeah.
consider what they've done. And I'd like to also say I really appreciate you not only inviting me, but I appreciate this whole series that you're doing. Um, there are a number of us who are not Seventh-day Adventists who are still very interested in what's going on in Seventh-day Adventism.
Mm.
And I think the kinds of questions you're asking are legitimate. And I hope you continue to get uh, some good people who will be candid with you about their assessment. So,
Mm.
uh, it's been enjoyable talking about some of these things that I haven't thought as much about over the last few years.
I hope I haven't spoken too much. As an interviewer,
No,
you're
no,
supposed
not
to
at
sit
all.
back and listen. Can
No,
before you go, can I ask you just two quick questions?
of course.
Can you tell us just a little bit about what you're doing now, where you are actually living? I didn't start with all of that, but just what are you involved with now? With what's your passion in ministry right now?
Yeah.
And then just to finish after that, um, can you just share a little bit of some closing thoughts on some positive memories that you take away from your experience with Walter Martin, having known
Yeah.
him?
Yeah, thank you very much. What a privilege to do that. Well, I worked at the Christian Research Institute with Walter Martin, and then when Walter died, Walter had a heart attack. He was only 60 years old, and I remember at the time I was right around 30, and I thought Walter was an old man. Now I'm 61, and I think Walter was very young when he died. I then went on to teach philosophy, and I continued a career in apologetics. I work for a apologetic organization called Reasons to Believe. It is primarily kind of science faith issues, but I'm on the scholar team. I'm the non-scientist, so my background is in theology and philosophy. I've written a number of books, most of them focusing on apologetic type issues. But at the end of my time at the Christian Research Institute, a few colleagues and I wrote a book, Prophets of the Apocalypse, where we looked at not just David Koresh, but I have a chapter in there on Adventism, kind of the backdrop of Koresh. but I have a number of apologetic books. Just finished a new one looking at kind of challenges to Christianity. And and you can go on reasons.org and you'll get on the website, type my name in. There's hundreds of articles that I've written on a variety of topics, books available. Walter Martin, some of the things that I really appreciate about Walter is, again, I really appreciate that in the 50s, there was this consensus that Adventism was a cult, but Walter wasn't afraid to go against the consensus. And I don't know any evangelical magazines today who would take a risk like Eternity Magazine took a risk. I think Walter had good instincts. Sometimes people kind of thought he was a heresy hunter. He was, he was going to tell everybody whether their doctrine was sound or not. Well, sometimes when you're involved in that kind of ministry, you can be perceived as being kind of tough. But I think Walter, he had a good balance. He wanted to defend historic Christian truth, but he wanted to include everybody who named the name of Christ. He didn't want to exclude a group that really was Christian. I admired that about Walter, and after Walter died, I thought, well, maybe I'll be the next Walter Martin. And I quickly discovered I didn't have his skill set or his personality. I'm a very different person. But he was a courageous man, and he was also an individual that had a deep love for the Bible. And so I miss him a lot. I have to say, when I was in the presence of Des Ford and Walter Martin, they were so friendly, and they were so gracious to each other. And the friendship that I had with both of them was really two of the finest friendships I've had in my professional life. And so I'm one of Walter Martin's boys, I guess you would say.
Look, Ken, it has just been fabulous chatting with you today. And I know lots of people will be continuing on the conversation in the comments, and we'll seek you out, your website that you've mentioned. And I'm very much looking forward to getting the links that you've talked about, because I think adding those resources to this series is just going to be more information that people can ponder and look at.
Very good.
So thank you so much, and we'll look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah.
And,
thank you, Peter. Pleasure.
Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.